Let me tell you something before I start. I've told this story maybe 4 times in my whole life. Once to a review board that didn't believe me. Once to my wife, who held my hand the entire way through and didn't say a word. Once to a kid who later turned out to be a journalist, which I regret. And now to you. I'm telling it again because the people who should be telling it are gone. Most of them anyway. And somebody has to. Somebody has to say what happened out past the Tessin Drift in the dead months when the galaxy decided humans were a joke worth laughing at one last time. So here, I was a sensor tech. That's it. That's all I was. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a captain. I didn't fire anything or save anyone. I sat in a chair and I watched numbers and I drank coffee that tasted like burnt rubber because the recyclers on the Halloran were 30 years past their service date. My job was to look at the dark and tell people what was in it. And one day the dark looked back. Okay, let me back up. You won't understand the ship unless you understand the war, and you won't understand the war unless you understand how small we were. In those years, humanity had been uplifted. That's the word they used, uplifted, like we were a litter of pups somebody decided to feed. The Conquered did it. The Galactic conquered, this council of 7 old species who'd been crossing stars before our ancestors figured out fire. They found us, decided we were interesting enough to keep around, gave us a few crumbs of technology, and slotted us into the bottom of their society like you'd shove a new hire into the worst desk in the office. We got worlds, not good ones. Marginal ones, the planets nobody else wanted, the ones with too much radiation or not enough water or weather that could peel the skin off a man in an afternoon. We got ships, but they were hand-me-downs, 2 generations behind whatever the real powers flew. And we got a role, labor, hauling, the dirty, dangerous, boring work of keeping a galactic economy running. The species that mattered had a name for us, HFY. You can translate it 100 ways, but the cleanest is the borrowed ones. As in, you've borrowed your seat at this table and we can take it back. I grew up hearing that word. We all did. It got under your skin. You'd be doing a perfect job, a flawless job, and some conquered officer with a voice like wet gravel would look at your work and say, acceptable for HFY, and walk off. After a while you stopped expecting respect. You just did the work and you went home and you tried not to think about it. Here's the thing nobody on the Conquered understood, though. They thought we resented being small. We didn't. Not really. What we resented was being told we couldn't be anything else. Those are different feelings. One of them makes you sad, the other one makes you patient. You should remember that, the patient part. So the war. It started over a system called Brennan's Reach, which I'd bet money you've never heard of. It was one of ours, a human colony, mining operation mostly, about 40,000 people scratching out a living on 3 rocks and a frozen moon. Not strategically important. Not rich. Nobody's prize. The Drevani wanted it anyway. The Drevani weren't part of the Conquered. They were outside it. This aggressive expansionist culture that the Conquered tolerated the way you tolerate a wasp's nest on the far edge of your property. You don't like it, but it's not worth the sting to deal with. The Drevani built warships the way other species built homes. It was the whole point of them. Their entire civilization was organized around the next conquest, and when they ran out of easy targets at their borders, they looked at the soft underbelly of conquered space and they saw us. The borrowed ones, the ones nobody would fight a war over. That was the calculation. The Drevani figured, correctly, it turned out that the Conquered wouldn't spend real blood defending a human mining colony. We weren't worth it. So they came to Brennan's Reach with 11 warships and they gave the colony 6 hours to evacuate. The colony didn't have ships for 40,000 people. They had ships for maybe 9,000. I want you to sit with that math for a second. 6 hours, 40,000 people, 9,000 seats. The colony administrator, a woman named Soria Okonkwo, sent a distress call to the Conquered. The Conquered acknowledged it. They convened a session. They debated. And while 7 ancient species sat in a comfortable hall 100 light-years away discussing whether the matter merited intervention, the Dravani got tired of waiting. They didn't wait the 6 hours. They glassed the colony in 4. I didn't see that part. Nobody human saw it and lived. We pieced it together later from a Dravani transmission they didn't bother to encrypt. They wanted us to hear it. The administrator's last message got out, though, just before the end. It was 11 seconds long, and I've heard it so many times I could recite it in my sleep, but I won't, because some things you don't repeat for an audience. The gist of it was, they came early, we're not going to make it, tell the others we tried. Tell the others we tried. When that recording reached the human worlds, something happened that the Conquered did not predict and could not understand. They expected grief. They expected us to mourn and accept it and go back to work, because that's what the borrowed ones did. We absorbed losses. We endured. That's not what happened. What happened was that every human shipyard in conquered space went dark for 48 hours. No transmissions, no traffic, nothing. The Conquered thought it was a strike, a labor action, and they were already drafting the penalties. It wasn't a strike, we were building something. Now here's where I come in finally. Sorry, I told you I'm not good at this. I was assigned to the Halloran, which was a converted or hauler, and I mean converted in the loosest sense of the word. They'd bolted some weapons onto a cargo ship and called it a frigate. We were part of what they were calling the Volunteer Fleet, which was a polite name for a collection of every human ship that could fly and fight, crewed by people who'd signed up after Brennan's reach. Miners, truckers, welders, people like me. We weren't a real military. Let's be honest. The Conquered had a real military, and so did the Dravani. We had a bunch of angry civilians in patched-up freighters and a command structure we were inventing as we went. Anybody with sense would have told us to go home. Our orders were to hold the line at the Tessin Drift. The drift was this enormous field of cold dust and dead comets, a kind of natural wall between the human worlds and the open lanes the Dravani were using to push deeper into our space. If they got through the drift, they'd be in among our colonies, and there'd be a dozen more Brennan's reaches. So we sat there, 41 ships, holding a line we had no business holding, against a Dravani war fleet that was, by every honest estimate, going to roll right over us. And we waited, and while we waited, the rumor started. You have to understand what a ship rumor is like. You're packed in a metal can with the same 200 people for weeks. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing to do between drills. So information moves like fire. A whisper at one end of the ship is gospel by the time it reaches the other. The rumor was about a ship. Not one of ours exactly, or well, that was the confusing part. Nobody could agree. It started with the engineers. One of the maintenance crew said she'd overheard a transmission, encrypted, but she'd caught a fragment of the header. A vessel designation that didn't match anything in the fleet registry. No name, just a code. And the code translated roughly to Vessel 0. That's it, Vessel 0. Somebody else said they'd seen it on a long-range scan during their shift, just for a second. A contact that read as a ship but had no transponder, no heat signature, no mass reading that made sense. They're one instant, gone the next. The kind of return you write off as sensor ghost. A third person, a guy named Petrovic who I didn't much like, swore up and down that command knew about it, that the brass had a black project, that while the rest of us were out here in our patched-up freighters, somebody back home had built something else, something they weren't telling us about. I didn't believe any of it. I want that on the record. I'm a sensor tech. I deal in returns and confirmations. A thing exists when I can measure it twice. And nobody could measure this thing once, let alone twice. So I filed it under scared people telling stories, and I went back to my chair and my Berntrubber coffee. I was wrong, obviously. You knew that already. But I was wrong in a specific way that I want to explain, because it matters for what comes later. I thought the rumor was about a ship. It wasn't about a ship, it was about us, what we'd become, what we were willing to build after Brennan's reach. The ship was just the shape that took. The Dravani came on the 19th day. I remember it was the 19th because we'd been keeping a count scratched into the wall of the mess hall, like prisoners, and somebody had drawn a little face next to the 19, and I never found out who. It started on my shift. Of course it did. The galaxy has a sense of humor about these things. I was at my station, half asleep, when the long-range board lit up. Not one contact. Not 10. The whole board went from black to a wall of red, and for a second I genuinely thought the system had malfunctioned, because nothing should produce that many returns at once. Then the count stabilized and I read it twice, the way I always do, and my stomach dropped through the deck. 68 Dravani warships. We had 41, and ours were freighters with guns. Theirs were warships built by a species that thought about nothing else. I called it up the line. My voice didn't shake, I'm proud of that, it's a small thing but it's mine, and I gave the captain the numbers. She was a former bulk hauler pilot named Inez Adami, and she had this calm about her that I've never seen in anyone since. She looked at the board, she looked at the 68, and she just said, well, they brought friends. That was it, that was her whole reaction, they brought friends. Then she keyed the fleet channel and started organizing a defense that everyone on that bridge knew was going to get us all killed. Let me describe what it's like to wait for a battle you're going to lose. It's quiet, that's the part nobody tells you. You'd think there'd be shouting, alarms, drama. There's a little of that at first. But mostly in the last hour before contact, the ship goes very, very quiet. People stop talking. They check their stations. They check them again. Somebody starts humming and stops, embarrassed. The recycled air feels thinner than usual, even though it isn't. You become aware of your own heartbeat in a way you never normally are. I thought about my wife. We weren't married yet then, she was my girlfriend, back on Keller's world, and I'd been a coward about proposing because I kept telling myself there'd be time. I sat in my chair watching 68 warships close on us and I thought, there isn't going to be time, you idiot. There was never going to be more time. There's only ever the time you take. I wrote her a message. I don't know if it ever sent. I told her I was sorry I'd waited and that the answer to the question I'd been too scared to ask was yes. It had always been yes. And if there was any way for these words to reach her, I wanted them to be the last thing she had from me. Then I hit send into a battle that was about to scramble every transmission for 100,000 kilometers, and I went back to watching the dark. The Dravani didn't hail us. They didn't demand surrender. They'd learned at Brennan's reach that they didn't need to. They just came on in a wedge formation, 68 strong, and they opened fire at the edge of effective range. The first human ship died 90 seconds into the battle. The Constantine. I watched its return wink out on my board and I knew there'd been 200 people on it and they were all just gone. A line of light and then nothing. The second ship died 40 seconds after that. We fought. God, we fought. Those freighter crews, those miners and truckers, they fought like nothing I've ever seen before or since. We weren't supposed to be able to fight at all and we made the Dravani bleed for every ship they took. We killed 9 of theirs in the first 10 minutes. 9. The casualty exchange should have been impossible. It was impossible. We did it anyway, with garbage ships and improvised tactics, and nothing but the absolute refusal to let them through to our colonies. But 9 isn't 68. The math doesn't care how brave you are. By the 20-minute mark, we'd lost 14 ships and the line was breaking, and I could see on my board that within the hour there would be no human fleet at the Tessin Drift, and then there would be no Tessin Drift line. And then there would be more Brennan's reaches, world after world after world. That's when Vessel Zero arrived. I almost missed it. That's the part that still gets me. I was tracking 3 Dravani heavies that had broken through on our flank and were lining up a run on the Halloran itself, and I was, frankly, in the process of deciding which thing I wanted to be looking at when I died. So I wasn't watching the deep board. I was watching the close board, the immediate threat, the ship's about to kill me. It was Petrovic, the guy I didn't like, who said it. He just said, very quietly, in a voice I'd never heard him use, "What is that?" Not a question. He didn't have the breath for a question. He just said it, "What is that?" And something in how he said it made me look at the deep board. There was a contact at the edge of the system. It had appeared without a transition flare, no jump signature, no arrival energy, nothing. Ships don't do that. You can't enter a system without leaving a mark. The physics doesn't allow it. But there it was, already there, as though it had been there the whole time and only just decided to let itself be seen. And it was dark. I don't mean it was unlit. I mean my instruments couldn't see it. I had a contact, a hole in the sensor return, a region of space that gave back nothing, not heat, not mass, not reflected light, a pure absence in the shape of a ship. My board didn't know what to call it. It tagged it with the only thing it could, a designation pulled from a registry I'd never had access to. Vessel Zero. The rumor was real, and it was sitting at the edge of the system, and it was the blackest thing I have ever seen, a silhouette of nothing against the faint glow of the drift. It sent no message. I want to be very clear about that because it's the thing everyone gets wrong when they tell this story secondhand. They add a speech. They have it broadcast some grand warning to the Dravani, some line about humanity, some threat. That never happened. Vessel Zero arrived in total silence, and it stayed silent, and it never said one word, not to them, not to us, not to anyone. It just started moving. The Dravani saw it. Of course they saw it. They had better sensors than we did. They'd have seen the same impossible hole in space that I was seeing. And they did what any rational warfleet does when an unidentified contact appears mid-battle. They redirected fire. 11 Dravani warships peeled off from our line and turned their weapons on Vessel Zero. I watched it happen on my board, this beautiful coordinated maneuver, the kind of thing that takes a real military to pull off, 11 heavy warships swinging onto a single target and unloading everything they had. I have seen a lot of weapons fire in my life. I've seen things that would put your hair white. I have never, before or since, seen a concentration of firepower like the one those 11 ships put onto Vessel Zero in the space of about 4 seconds. It should have vaporized anything. It should have left nothing but expanding gas. The fire reached Vessel Zero. And then it stopped, not deflected, not absorbed by shields the way our shields absorbed fire, flaring and straining and overloading. The energy reached the black silhouette and it simply ended, the way a sound ends in a room with no echo. 11 warships worth of weapons fire poured into that darkness, and the darkness took all of it and gave back nothing, not even a flicker. Vessel Zero did not slow down. It did not return fire. It just kept moving, on this smooth, unhurried line, straight toward the 11 ships that were trying to kill it. I heard somebody on the bridge start to pray, quietly, in a language I didn't know, and I remember thinking in this detached, falling away part of my mind, yes, that, whatever that is the correct response. The first Dravani ship to die didn't explode. I keep coming back to that, because it's wrong. It violates everything I knew about how ships die, and 20 years later I still don't fully understand what I watched. When you kill a ship, it comes apart. There's a hull breach, an atmosphere venting, a reactor going critical, fire, debris, a death you can read in the sensor data like a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. I'd watched 14 human ships die that way already that day. I knew the shape of it. The Dravani ship didn't do any of that. Vessel Zero passed near it, didn't touch it, just passed within a few kilometers, and the Dravani warships return on my board simply decremented. The mass reading dropped. The heat signature dropped. The transponder cut out. In the space of about 2 seconds. A 400-meter warship with a crew of several hundred went from a full, healthy sensor return to nothing. And there was no debris, no gas, no fire, no death story in the data. It was there, and then the reading said it was not there, and there was nothing in between. It wasn't destroyed. Destruction leaves evidence. This left absence. Petrovic beside me said one word. He said erased. And that's the word that stuck. That's the word that went through the whole human fleet in the next 10 minutes and through the whole human species in the next 10 days, and that's the word they used in the history books, the few that dared write it down. Erased. Because that's what it looked like. It didn't look like Vessel Zero killed that ship. It looked like Vessel Zero reached over and unmade it, edited it out of reality, took it off the board the way you delete a line you decided you didn't need. Then it did it again. Then it did it again. I'm going to slow down here, because I need you to understand the feeling, not just the events. You spend your whole life being told you're small, the borrowed ones, acceptable for Telikve. You build that into yourself brick by brick, year by year, until you genuinely believe it, until the smallness isn't something they put on you anymore. It's just true. It's just the shape of the world. The big species are big and you are small, and that's how it is. And then you watch a black ship that came from your own shipyards, built in those 48 dark hours after Brennan's reach, move through a Drevani war fleet, the most feared fighting force in the region, 68 strong, and erase them. One by one, in silence, without taking a scratch, without breaking stride. It does something to you. I won't pretend it was a clean feeling. There was joy in it, sure, the savage, ugly joy of watching the people who glassed 40,000 of your own get what they had coming. I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. But underneath the joy there was something colder and stranger, and it took me years to find the word for it. It was recognition. Because somewhere in those 48 dark hours, somebody human had sat down and decided that we were done being small. Not just angry we'd been for a long time. Done borrowing. Done accepting losses. Done being the species that absorbed the blow and went back to work. And they'd poured everything we were into a single black hull and sent it out to make the point in a language nobody could mistake. The point was, never again. And the galaxy was learning to read it. The Drevani broke. I'd never seen a war fleet break before. I've seen ships flee, individual ships, captains making the call to run. But a whole fleet, 60-some warships, simultaneously deciding that the battle was no longer survivable and trying to flee at once, that I'd never seen, and it is a chaotic, ugly, desperate thing to watch. They stopped firing on us entirely. Every gun in the Drevani fleet turned toward Vessel Zero, and it didn't matter. The fire just vanished into the black the way it had the first time, and Vessel Zero kept on its unhurried way, erasing ship after ship, and the Drevani panicked. They tried to jump out. But here's the thing about a jump, you have to spin up to it. It takes time, and Vessel Zero was among them now, moving through their formation like a shark through a school of fish, and every ship that tried to spin up a jump just gave Vessel Zero a slightly easier target while it sat there charging. I counted, that's my job counting. I sat at my station and I counted the Drevani fleet dropping off my board. 68, 61, 53, 40. Captain Adami gave an order I'll never forget. She said, "Cease fire. All ships cease fire." For a second nobody understood. Cease fire. In the middle of a battle. But she understood something the rest of us hadn't caught up to yet. She said it again, and then she said why, and her voice was very steady and very quiet. "We're not part of this anymore. Hold position and watch. Let them see who's doing this. Let them see it's not us." And that was the masterstroke, though I didn't appreciate it for years. Because the Drevani in their last minutes looked for the thing that was killing them, and it wasn't the human freighter fleet. The human freighter fleet had stopped shooting. The human freighter fleet was just sitting there, in formation, watching. The thing erasing them was something else entirely, something dark and silent and unbothered, and the humans weren't even bothering to participate anymore. That's the image the survivors carried home. Not humans desperately fighting for their lives. Humans standing aside, lowering their weapons, watching the executioner work because they didn't need to fight anymore. They had something that did it for them. Nothing frightens an enemy like being made irrelevant. 11 Drevani warships escaped, out of 68. Vessel Zero let them go. I want to be precise about that word "let" because it's deliberate. It could have caught them. It had caught everything else. Nothing about the 11 that fled was meaningfully faster or harder to reach than the 57 it had already erased. It chose not to. It pursued to the edge of the system, close enough that there could be no doubt it was choosing, and then it stopped, and it let the 11 survivors spin up their jumps and flee into the dark. Adami understood that too. She said later when we talked about it, "You don't kill all of them, you kill enough. You always leave some alive to carry the story. A massacre nobody learns from. A warning everybody learns from. We sent 11 teachers home." 11 teachers, carrying one lesson, in the only language the galaxy had never bothered to learn from us, because they'd never thought we had anything to say. Never again. I should tell you what Vessel Zero did after. It came back through the system on that same unhurried line, past the wreckage of the battle, past the debris of our own dead, the Constantine, the others, 14 human ships and 200 souls each. And it slowed. For the first time since it arrived, it slowed. It came to a stop relative to our fleet, maybe 1,000 kilometers off, a perfect black silhouette against the glow of the drift, and it just sat there, facing us. The whole surviving human fleet, 20-some battered freighters, and this single impossible black ship sitting in front of us in total silence. It sent no message. I told you it never sent a message, and it never did, not even then. But I had my board up, and I was watching it the way I watched everything, and I saw something my instruments could barely register. A pulse. Very faint. A single, low, deliberate pulse of, I don't even know what to call it. My board logged it as an anomaly and nothing more, that swept out from Vessel Zero and washed over our fleet and was gone. It wasn't a weapon. Obviously it wasn't a weapon, we're still here. It wasn't a transmission, not one we could decode. It was just a pulse. One, aimed at us and only at us and at no one else. I've thought about that pulse for 20 years. I've come to believe, and I can't prove this, it's just what I believe, that it was the closest thing to a message Vessel Zero ever sent. Not words. It didn't deal in words. Just a single touch, ship to fleet, the way you might rest a hand on the shoulder of someone you'd come to stand beside. The way you might say, without saying anything, "I see you. You're not small, you were never small, go home." And then it was gone. No jump flare, the same as its arrival there, and then a hole where it had been, and then not even that. Vessel Zero left the way it came, in silence, having said nothing, and erased everything, and the galaxy was never the same after. That's the battle. That's what I saw, from a sensor chair on a converted or hauler, on the 19th day at the Tessin Drift. But it's not the end of the story. It's barely the middle. Because the question you're asking, the question everyone asks, the question that review board asked me with their arms crossed and their faces already decided, is the same one I was asking myself as I sat in that chair watching the black ship vanish. What was it? Where did it come from? Who built it? How does a species at the bottom of galactic society, a species flying hand-me-down freighters, a species the conquered called the borrowed ones, how does that species produce a thing that erases warfleets in silence and walks away untouched? I spent the next 3 years of my life finding out, and the answer is stranger and sadder and more human than anything you're imagining right now. I'll tell you in the second part. I need a minute first. This part, the battle, I can tell without my hands shaking because I was there and I know what I saw. The next part I had to learn secondhand. From people who didn't want to talk and documents that were never supposed to exist, and it cost me more than I want to admit. But you've come this far, you should know the rest. Just give me a minute. Okay, I've had my minute. In the first part I told you what I saw with my own eyes. This part is different. This part I had to dig for, and some of it I'm still not sure I was ever supposed to know. So I'll tell you where each piece comes from, and you can decide for yourself what to believe. But I'll tell you up front, every horrible part of this is true. I checked. I checked until I wished I hadn't. After the battle, the survivors went home heroes, sort of. It was a strange kind of hero's welcome because nobody could agree on what we'd done. We'd held the Tessin Drift, yes. The line never broke. The Drevani never got through to the colonies, and that was real, that mattered. But we all knew, every one of us, that we hadn't won that battle. We'd been losing it. We'd been 20 minutes from annihilation. Something else won it, and that something else wasn't us, and it had vanished without a word. The Conquered wanted to know what it was. Obviously. A black ship that erased 57 Drevani warships in silence is not a thing a galactic superpower can simply ignore. They demanded answers from the human worlds. They sent investigators. They convened another session. They loved their sessions, and this one they did not adjourn. And the human governments, every one of them, said the same thing. We don't know. Here's what's wild. They were telling the truth. Most of them genuinely didn't know. The thing that built Vessel Zero wasn't a government program. It wasn't a fleet command project. It was something that happened in the gaps, in those 48 dark hours, in a place the official record didn't reach. It took me 3 years to find that place. I'm going to take you there now. It started with the shipyards going dark. I told you about that in the first part, how every human shipyard in conquered space went silent for 48 hours after Brennan's reach, and the Conquered thought it was a strike. It wasn't a strike, but it also wasn't exactly a coordinated program. That's the thing nobody understood, the thing that made it impossible for the Conquered to find anyone to blame. What happened was simpler and stranger than a conspiracy. What happened was that a few hundred human engineers, scattered across a dozen worlds, working in a dozen different shipyards, all independently decided, in the hours after they heard that 11-second message, tell the others we tried that they were done. And they all reached for the same thing. You have to understand what human engineers had been doing for decades by then. We were the labor species. We maintained Conquered technology. We didn't build it. The Conquered didn't trust us with the real designs, but we maintained it, repaired it, kept it running, and you cannot do that for 40 years without understanding it. You can't repair a thing you don't understand. The Conquered thought they were keeping us in the dark by not teaching us. But we learned anyway, in the maintenance bays, with our hands inside their machines, the way a mechanic learns an engine better than the man who designed it. And there was one technology the Conquered guarded above all others, one thing they never, ever let us touch. They called it, in their language, by a word that translates to the quiet field. We called it the null drive, though almost no human had ever seen one work. It was the heart of their most advanced warships. It was how their best ships moved without sensor signatures, how they appeared without jump flares, how they were so hard to track. A field that, and I'm simplifying enormously because I'm a sensor tech, not a physicist, a field that doesn't hide a ship so much as it partially removes it from the local frame, makes it less present. The ship is still there, but reality is less sure about it, less committed to it. The Conquered had this technology. They used it for stealth, for sneaking, for getting their warships into position unseen. A human engineer named Dr. Yusuf Adisa, and remember that name, because it's the saddest name in this whole story, had spent 11 years maintaining quiet field generators in a Conquered repair facility. 11 years with his hands inside the most guarded technology in the region. And in those 11 years, in the gaps between his official duties, Yusuf Adisa figured out something the Conquered had never figured out, or maybe had figured out and been too sane to pursue. He figured out what happens if you don't partially remove a ship from reality. He figured out what happens if you turn the quiet field all the way up. I met Adisa's daughter. This is the part of the story I got firsthand, 3 years after the battle, in a small kitchen on a cold world I won't name. Her name was Amara, and she was about my age, and she had her father's eyes, which I knew because by then I'd seen his employee records, the few that survived. She didn't want to talk to me at first. I don't blame her. I showed up at her door a stranger, asking about a father she'd lost, claiming I'd seen the thing he made. But I told her about the pulse, that single faint pulse Vessel Zero sent us before it vanished, and something in her face changed, and she let me in, and she made me tea, and she told me what her father had done. The 48 dark hours, she said, weren't dark to him. He didn't sleep through them, he worked. He'd had the theory for years, the full field theory. He'd never built it because he understood what it meant, and because he was, by every account, a gentle man who loved his work and his daughter and didn't much care about being remembered. The Concord's quiet field made a ship less present. Addis's full field, if you pushed it past the limit the Concorde had carefully designed it never to reach, wouldn't make the ship less present. It would make everything around the ship less present. It projected. That was the breakthrough and the horror of it. A field that, at full strength, radiated outward from the hull and reduced the presence of anything it touched. Matter, energy, ships, weapons, fire, anything that entered the field's reach became, like the ship itself, something reality was no longer fully committed to. And reality, it turns out, does not hold on to things it isn't committed to. That's what erasure was. That's what I watched on my board. Vessel Zero didn't shoot those Drevani warships. It extended its field around them, and for 2 seconds those ships became things the universe wasn't sure existed, and then the universe made up its mind. There was no debris because there was nothing to leave behind. The ships didn't break apart. They stopped being included. Amara told me her father wept when he understood it would work. He didn't weep with joy. He wept because he knew what he was about to do, and he knew there was no taking it back, and he knew that he, a gentle man who loved his work, was about to build the most terrible weapon the region had ever seen and aim it at living crews. But he kept thinking about that message. Tell the others we tried, 40,000 people, 9,000 seats, 6 hours that turned into 4. And he built it. He didn't build it alone, of course. One man can't build a warship in 48 hours, not even a small one. This is where the strangest part comes in, the part the Concorde investigators could never untangle. Addis put out a call. Not to governments, not to fleet command. He sent his field equations, the dangerous ones, the full field theory the Concorde had spent 40 years making sure no human ever saw, to a list of people he trusted. Engineers he'd worked with, friends, a few former students, a few hundred people scattered across a dozen worlds, all of them sitting in their dark shipyards in the hours after Brennan's reach, all of them feeling the exact same thing he was feeling. And they answered. Nobody ordered them to. That's what the Concorde never understood and never could understand, because their whole society ran on order and rank and command. There was no command here. There was just a few hundred grieving, furious, brilliant people who received a set of equations and a hull design from a colleague they trusted, looked at what it could do, understood exactly what it meant, and decided, each of them alone in the dark, that the answer was yes. They built it in pieces, a field generator here, a hull section there, power systems on a third world, each piece shipped in cargo holds, mislabeled, buried in routine freight the Concorde never bothered to inspect because it was just Telekve hauling Telekve junk. They assembled it in the gap between 2 dead comets in a system nobody monitored. Amara didn't know exactly where. Her father never told her to protect her, and he was right too. Because the investigators came for her anyway, and she truly had nothing to give them. 48 hours, a few hundred people, no government, no command, no plan beyond never again. And at the end of it, they had Vessel Zero, a black hull around a field that could erase fleets. No name because they didn't think it deserved one. No transmitter because it had nothing to say. No crew of hundreds because it didn't need them. It had a crew of 1. I asked Amara who flew it. I'd assumed, everyone assumed, that a ship like that, a weapon like that, must have been flown remotely or by some volunteer pilot, somebody young and angry who climbed in knowing they might not come back. She just looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Who do you think?" And I understood, and I felt the floor drop out of me the same way it had on the bridge of the Halloran when I read those 68 contacts. Yusuf Adisa flew it himself. Of course he did. He was the only one who fully understood the field, its limits, its dangers, the razor-thin margin between less present and gone forever. He couldn't ask anyone else to fly it because he wasn't sure anyone else could fly it without erasing themselves along with the target. The full field didn't distinguish friend from enemy. It reduced the presence of everything it touched. Flying Vessel Zero meant sitting at the heart of a field that was constantly, gently trying to unmake you, and holding it back by sheer understanding, second by second, for the entire mission. The Drevani fire vanished into the black not because Vessel Zero had armor. It vanished because it entered the field and stopped being committed to. And Yusuf Adisa sat in the middle of that, alone, a gentle man who loved his daughter, and he held reality together around himself by knowing the equations better than anyone alive, and he flew his impossible black ship into a war fleet of 68, and he erased 57 of them, and he let 11 go to carry the lesson home, and he came back through the wreckage and he stopped in front of our battered little fleet. And he sent the pulse. The pulse I logged as an anomaly, the single faint touch, ship to fleet, that I've spent 20 years believing was a message. Amara told me what it was. She knew because her father had told her he would do it, in the message he left her before he flew, the message she let me read once and only once, and which I will not repeat because it was hers and her father's and not the galaxy's. The pulse wasn't aimed at the Drevani. It was never aimed at the Drevani. It was aimed at us, at the human fleet, at the miners and truckers and welders who'd held the line in their garbage ships and were never supposed to survive. It was a goodbye. Because Yusuf Adisa knew he wasn't coming home. Holding the full field together for the length of that battle was beyond what any human body could survive. The field had been gently unmaking him the entire time, and there's a limit, and he'd reached it somewhere in the middle of that Drevani fleet and kept going anyway. He had just enough left to finish the job, to let the 11 go, to stop in front of us, the people he'd saved, and send one last pulse. Not words, he never dealt in words, just a touch. "I see you, you're not small, you were never small, go home." And then Vessel Zero vanished, no jump flare, just a hole and then not even that, and it was never found, and no wreckage was ever recovered, and the Conquered searched for years and found nothing, because there was nothing to find. He didn't die the way ships die, with debris and a death story in the data. He went the way everything in that field went. He stopped being included. Conquered never got their answer. That's the thing that still makes me smile in a tired way. The most powerful council in the region, 7 ancient species, and they never figured out what Vessel Zero was or where it came from. They couldn't. There was no program to uncover, no command structure to interrogate, no surviving ship to examine. There was just a dead gentle man and a few hundred grieving engineers who, when questioned, told the truth. We don't know who flew it. We don't know where it is. It's gone. You can't prosecute a feeling. You can't subpoena never again. The Conquered understood order and rank and command, and the thing that beat the Drevani at the Tessin Drift had none of those, and so it was, to them, genuinely incomprehensible. A weapon with no owner, a victory with no commander, a message with no words. But here's what they did understand, every one of them. The 7 ancient species who'd called us the borrowed ones for 40 years. They understood that it could happen again. That somewhere in their maintenance bays, in their repair facilities, in the gaps and the dark hours, the species they dismissed as labor had been learning, had had its hands inside their most guarded technology the whole time, and that if you pushed us hard enough, if you glassed a colony and let 40,000 people die, because we weren't worth a session that ran long, We would reach into the dark and build something that erased your war fleets in silence and asked for nothing in return, not even the credit. They stopped saying Telikve after that, not all at once, but it faded out of official use within a few years and then out of common use, and now you almost never hear it. The borrowed ones gave their seat back. We took our own. Nobody calls us small anymore. I went home eventually. I married the woman I'd written that cowardly, last-minute message to from the censor chair, the message that, it turned out, never sent, scrambled in the battle like I knew it would be. So I asked her the question in person instead, the way I should have done in the first place. She said yes. She'd have said yes the whole time. There was only ever the time I took. We named our son Yusuf. She never asked me why. I think she knew. I told her the story by then, the whole story, holding her hand the way she held mine, and when I got to the part about the pulse she cried, and so did I, and we didn't say anything for a long time. I think about Addisa more than I think about almost anyone. A gentle man who loved his work and his daughter and didn't care about being remembered. He got his wish, in a way. Almost nobody knows his name. The history books, the few that dared write it down, just call it Vessel Zero, the black ship that sent no message and erased fleets. They make it sound like a weapon, a machine, a mystery. But it wasn't a machine. It was a man. It was the most human thing I have ever seen, a person who looked at an impossible weight, a debt that could never be repaid, 40,000 dead and a galaxy that didn't care, and who decided to carry it himself so the rest of us wouldn't have to. Who built the most terrible thing in the region and aimed it at the people who'd earned it, and then made absolutely sure that the last thing he did with it was reach out, gently, to the people he'd saved, and tell them they were not small. That's not a weapon, that's love, the terrible, total, world-ending kind, the kind that doesn't send a message because it doesn't need to, the kind you don't survive. So that's the whole story. That's everything I saw and everything I dug up and everything it cost me. People ask me sometimes if I'm proud of what we did at the Tessin Drift, and I tell them the truth, which is that I didn't do anything. I sat in a chair and I counted ships, and I watched a gentle man erase himself to save people he'd never met. But I'm proud of him. I'm proud of the few hundred who built it with him, who answered a set of equations from a friend in the dark and decided the answer was yes. I'm proud that when the galaxy finally pushed us too far, the thing we reached for wasn't cruelty for its own sake. We let 11 ships go, remember. We always meant to leave teachers alive. The thing we reached for was enough. Enough to make the point. Enough to say never again in the only language they'd ever bother to learn from us. And then a quiet touch ship to fleet for the ones who lived, because that part mattered to him too, maybe most of all. I'm an old man now. My son is grown. My wife is gone these 4 years, and I miss her the way you miss your own breathing. I don't have many stories left in me, and I've told this one as well as I'm ever going to tell it. So let me leave you with the thing I always leave people with. It's not mine. It's something Amara said to me in that cold kitchen when I finally got up to go, when I'd heard the whole terrible truth and didn't know what to do with my face. She walked me to the door, and she said, "They thought the silence meant we had nothing to say. They never understood. The silence was the message. We were just waiting for them to learn how to listen. Go home, you're not small. You were never small." End of part 2. That's the complete 2-part script. A few quick notes for the narration. The whole thing reads aloud at a deliberate, slightly weary pace. The narrator is an old man, so the pauses, "Just give me a minute, okay? I've had my minute," are natural breath points and good spots for a music swell or beat of silence. The emotional turns are front-loaded into short sentences on purpose so they land when spoken rather than read. I kept every name, the setting, the ship's nature, and the twist, the lone pilot/gentle engineer, original, so it won't overlap with other titles you send. When you give me the next title, I'll build a fresh world, fresh names, and a fresh emotional core from scratch. Want me to tighten either part toward a specific runtime? Punch up the hook for a thumbnail-friendly opening line, or adjust the tone, more action-forward versus more emotional. You said. Part 2, Part 210, 08 AM. Claude responded. Part 2 is already written above. It's included in my previous response, right after Part 1, under the heading, The Black Ship Sent No Message. It's simply ERAS. Part 2 is already written above. It's included in my previous response, right after Part 1, under the heading, The Black Ship Sent No Message. It simply erased Fleet's Part 2 of 2. It covers the origin of Vessel Zero, the shipyards going dark, Dr. Yusuf Adisa and the full field theory, the few hundred engineers who built it in secret, the revelation that Adisa flew it alone and erased himself to save the fleet, the meaning of the pulse, and the closing line from his daughter Amara. So you already have the full story. A couple of things I can do if that's what you're after. If Part 2 didn't load fully on your end or got cut off, tell me and I'll repost it cleanly on its own. If you felt Part 2 was too short and wanted expanded to hit the full 8,000,000 word target, the version above is tighter than that. I can flesh it out, more scenes with Amara, a fuller account of the 3 years the narrator spent digging, the Concord investigation, the engineers who built the ship, the aftermath on the human worlds. That would get it to length without padding. Which one do you need, a clean repost or an expanded, longer version? Just so I point my effort the right way.